This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Illinois Broadcasters Foundation, Incorporated. Information on careers in broadcasting is available at www.ilba.org. Additional support comes from the individual members of the Lincoln Academy of Illinois. From the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois, the Lincoln Academy of Illinois presents Reflections on Lincoln, Conversations with Bicentennial Laureates of the Lincoln Academy of Illinois. On February 7, 2009, the Lincoln Academy honored 30 distinguished citizens of the world who have, in lasting and significant ways, preserved the memory of Abraham Lincoln, contributing to Lincoln's defining influence on the American spirit. The Lincoln Academy is pleased to present extended interviews with 6 of the bicentennial laureates in honor of the 200th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. This program features a conversation with Dr. Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University, one of the country's most prominent historians who has written extensively on Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. Dr. Foner is interviewed by Illinois State Historian Dr. Thomas Schwartz, who was also honored as a bicentennial laureate of the Lincoln Academy.
You come from a distinguished line of historians. Your father, Jack, was a historian. Your uncle, Philip Foner. Is it in the genes, or how did you come to it?
Well, I'm sure it is in the genes. We don't quite know our own genes. My father, Jack Foner, wrote about blacks in the military in American history. My uncle, Philip Foner, was a tremendously prolific scholar. He was the first one to really put together the writings of Frederick Douglass a long time ago, back in 1950, when Frederick Douglass was barely known. Now he's a very prominent figure in any accounts of American history. And he did many, many other things too. So, you know, a historian looking at this would say, oh, well, it was inevitable that I would be a historian. But it wasn't that way at all. I went to college to be an astronomer. First 2 years of college, I took science, physics, astronomy, calculus. I wasn't going to be a historian. But 2 things happened. One, well, I guess 3 things happened. One, the civil rights movement was at its peak. And you know, everyone was getting interested in where did this come from? What is the history that led up to this crisis in American society? The history of race, the history of slavery, Jim Crow. Secondly, I had the occasion to take a course in Civil War era history with a very inspiring teacher, not very well known because he didn't really write that much, but at Columbia, a guy named James Shenton, who was a mesmerizing teacher and really conveyed this love of history. And third, I ran out of ability in advanced calculus, I have to say. You know, I just really reached a wall where I couldn't move forward in what I wanted to do, so I decided to turn to something easier, which was history. I'd had all this interest in history from my family, but it was really in the middle of my college career that I switched over and said, all right, I'm going to become a history major, and so all those things kind of fed into it.
So you were at Columbia, you studied with Richard Hofstadter.
Right.
Tell us a little about that.
Well, I studied at Hofstadter. I graduated from Columbia as an undergraduate. Then I actually went to Oxford for 2 years. I had a fellowship, which was great. And there I learned a whole different kind of history, British history, economic history, social history, which was just really developing then. The writings of, you know, British historians like Eric Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson, which hadn't really made an impact in the U.S. quite yet. So it really expanded the whole cast of characters, you might say, in history, talking about, you know, more ordinary people, working people, the history of what they called history from the bottom up at that time. Then I came back and did my PhD at Columbia in the late 60s, and that's when I really got to know Hofstadter and worked with him, and he was my PhD supervisor. And he, of course, was a brilliant historian, a great writer, really emphasized the importance of the literary side. You know, you're not just throwing facts on a page. You really have to write in a way that is accessible and not simplified, but just making it accessible to people outside the academic, the little academic community. And I think, you know, that really has influenced me in trying at least to write in a way that's not just purely academic.
That was fairly running against the grain, though. That was at the time when things were getting, you know, more monographic,
yes.
and
Although Columbia always had a tradition of historians who, maybe it's because we were in New York City, the media, magazines, early television were always trying to get Columbia historians to do things. So if you look back, you can go all the way back to Charles Beard, Alan Nevins, Henry Steele Commager, and Hofstadter. These were people who wrote for a broad audience. Hofstadter wasn't really that great a teacher. In other words, he was interested in his writing in lectures. He was pretty boring, actually. But as a supervisor of work, of doctoral work, he was very, very good. You could talk to him. He was a great critic, which is what you need. Just give him a chapter and he will really go over it page by page, line by line, you know, not just for content, but for how you're expressing yourself, some ideas you might have sloughed over or gaps in your argument. So, you know, so I think I was very privileged to work with Hofstadter. I might have been his last PhD student because he passed away very, very soon after I defended my, my doctorate.
And what was that on?
My doctorate? It was my first book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, the ideology of the Republican Party before the Civil War. It was about the rise of the Republican Party. Lincoln, of course, plays a role in that, along with other figures of that period. More about their ideas, how they forged an outlook about slavery and about Northern society. I guess in a sentence, my contribution was that I argued anti-slavery is not just anti. It's an affirmation of a whole different kind of society of the North, a society with economic opportunity, a society of mobility that Lincoln himself exemplified, obviously, and talked about a lot. And so that really you have a clash not only over slavery, but about what really America ought to look like. What is the future of American society? Is it going to go down the road of the South, or is it going to go down the road of the Northern free labor society? And once you put it that way, the Civil War begins to look a lot more inevitable in a way. It's not just it's not easy to compromise. It's not easy to say, well, let's just, you know, get the politicians together and work out a deal, because you've got a pretty basic difference there about the future of the whole country.
And that book still remains a kind of a modern classic. I mean,
well,
were you surprised at
kind of you to
staying
say.
Power?
Well, it's still in print, and
yeah.
that was published in 1970, so that's a good while ago. And of course, I'm very gratified. It's still used in some, you know, college classes. Of course, yeah, you don't expect your doctoral dissertation to still be something people are talking about 40 years later. Sometimes people come up to me and say, you know, I've read a lot of your books. My favorite is your first book. And I'm never sure whether that's a compliment. I take it as a compliment. Mm-hmm. You could say that saying, well, it's been downhill ever since, but I don't think that's what they mean entirely.
You're probably best known for your work in Reconstruction
mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Reconstruction, of course, is the period right after the American Civil War. Still, in a way, one of the most controversial and misunderstood eras.
Do you have a pat answer to that question that everyone asks about Lincoln?
Well,
Lincoln
what would have people do ask me, of course. Yeah. I lecture on Reconstruction a lot, and I'm always asked what would have happened if Lincoln had not died. We don't really know. You know, Lincoln had certain plans or statements about Reconstruction, but they were wartime statements. Sure. They were, at least in good measure, ways of winning the war and appealing to Southerners and trying, you know, so that was what Lincoln was putting forward during the war was not a blueprint for the whole post-war South. You know, what happens in Reconstruction, as you know, is this tremendous crisis, partly because President Andrew Johnson, who succeeds Lincoln, lacked just about all of Lincoln's qualities of greatness. Lincoln was open-minded, open to criticism, willing to change his mind. Johnson was narrow and rigid and, you know, just didn't, once he made a decision, that was it. He didn't want to hear about it or think about it again. Johnson didn't have any real connection with Northern public opinion. He was from Tennessee. He was really a Democrat. Lincoln, of course, was really had his finger on the popular pulse all the way through his career. So, you know, it's impossible to imagine Lincoln getting himself into the fix that Johnson did, where he was totally alienated from the Congress. And of course, eventually they impeach him, and they all come within one vote of removing him from office. I think Lincoln would have done what he did during the Civil War, which is work out some kind of accommodation with the Republican majority in Congress. You probably would have ended up with something like Reconstruction looked like in 1866. That is, protection for the basic civil rights of the former slaves. You know, there was violence, there was all this efforts in the South after the Civil War to put them back into a condition not that far from slavery. Lincoln, even at the very end of his life, was talking about black suffrage for some African Americans in the South. I think you would have probably seen that. Limited black suffrage, maybe with an education requirement or a property qualification. Would that have satisfied everybody? No, of course not. But I think if you'd had a Reconstruction plan that was agreed to by Congress and the President, where you had a united policy rather than the divided government that you had when Johnson was in there, it might have had greater staying power. You know, it's possible. We don't know, and there were tremendous obstacles to Reconstruction succeeding. Racism was very deep, as you well know, North and South. But I think it's possible to imagine more progress being made than actually was made at the time. And I think, you know, Lincoln, I think, would have, with Lincoln's leadership, I think it's possible Reconstruction could have had a slightly more successful outcome than it ended up with.
Wasn't the question of land distribution as well
an
issue?
Land, of course, was a giant issue. The former slaves, you know, used this phrase, 40 acres and a mule. They said, look, we're free, but freedom, as Lincoln himself had said, freedom means some kind of economic wherewithal. And they said, you know, we've worked for a long time without any compensation. We deserve land. We want land. Give us the land. We've worked on this land, 40 acres of land. You know, then we can be really independent. Then we can be free. We don't have to rely on whites for our livelihood. Now, Lincoln had never shown any interest in land distribution. There were people like Thaddeus Stevens, the great radical Republican from Pennsylvania, others who talked about that, but most Northern Republicans were not really enthusiastic about it. It seemed too much an affront to the idea of private property to take land from one group and redistribute it to another group. Now, someone may say we already did that with the Native Americans out in the West. You know, we took their land to get, but Native Americans somehow occupied a different place in the American psyche at that time. So I don't think Lincoln was interested in the massive social revolution that land distribution would have maintained. On the other hand, Lincoln always said, even when it was not popular to say so before the Civil War, that black people were entitled to the pursuit of happiness that the Declaration of Independence offers to everybody. And I think he would have realized that the way the white South was trying to shape Reconstruction was not allowing blacks the pursuit of happiness. You know, they passed these black codes, these laws that basically so restricted African Americans that it would have been impossible for them to get ahead. And I think, you know, so Lincoln wanted people to have opportunity. He didn't have a concept of government redistributing land, but he certainly would have wanted people to have the opportunity to move ahead, to acquire land if they could, you know, earn the money to do so. So again, you know, he wasn't a radical Republican like Thaddeus Stevens, but he certainly would listen to radical Republicans as well as other Republicans, and some kind of moderate compromise, I think, would have emerged.
We've obviously celebrated the election of Barack Obama, but it seems that the greater triumph occurred in Reconstruction with the election of black legislators for the first time, and you've written about that.
Yeah, well, I think that is a remarkable moment, Reconstruction, and of course the election of Obama in a way sheds light back onto Reconstruction. You know, for example, in all of American history, since George Washington to the present, there have only been 6 African American senators. In all that time, 3 of them have been from Illinois, which is an interesting fact. Carol Braun, Obama, and now Senator Burris. But the first 2 were during Reconstruction. 2 black men from Mississippi, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, were elected to the U.S. Senate in the 1870s from Mississippi. Now, that shows you what a remarkable moment. This is 10 years after the beginning of the Civil War, 5 years after the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in the whole country. And now you have African Americans as equal members of the political nation, voting, holding office from every level, from justice of the peace, you know, and school board official, up to members of the state legislature, and then up to state officials. There was one governor briefly, lieutenant governor, secretary of state. 16, I think, elected to the House of Representatives during Reconstruction, and these 2 senators. So this is the first moment that America really becomes an interracial democracy, a democracy that black people can really participate in, as well as white people, which had never really had been before. Now, of course, Reconstruction does not succeed, and it is overthrown. You get the whole period afterward of Jim Crow, of segregation, of disenfranchisement, and it takes almost a century for the country to come back to the agenda or the promise of Reconstruction during the civil rights era of the 1960s. And now the election of a black man as president, you know, whatever party you are, whether you approve him or not, is still, or must be seen as a remarkable thing in our history, given the long and tortured, you know, history of race in America. So Obama is standing on the shoulders, in some ways, of the Reconstruction officials who were the first African Americans to really become prominent figures in our political life.
You've also been involved in more popular culture venues. You've done some consulting with Disney.
Absolutely.
And revising the scripts for the Hall of Presidents.
And Meet Mr. Lincoln.
Well,
you know, that's, I'm the kind of historian who, how shall I put this? I like to complain. Don't go to a historical movie with me because I'll ruin it for you. You know, I'll be sitting there, that's not accurate. No, that's completely wrong, you know. And years ago, when I was a visiting professor one year in LA at UCLA, and my daughter was probably about 5 or something at the time, I took her to Disneyland. And after all the enjoyable things, I said, you know, they have this exhibit here, Meet Mr. Lincoln, and let's just go in and see what that is. I don't know what it is. She wasn't that interested, but I dragged her in, and it was, you know, it was a show about Lincoln, and it had these, what do they call, animatronic? This
audio animatronic.
Yeah, this Lincoln who kind of got up and twitched around a little and gave some speeches, and a sort of slideshow, it was very low tech, a slideshow on the Civil War, and I was appalled because it was so out of date from the point of view of historians. It never mentioned the word slavery at all. In all the images put up, there was no image of a black person whatsoever. And the speeches that they chose to use of Lincoln were completely kind of unrepresentative. You know, they were like minor little speeches from one time. You know, they didn't have anything from his real great oratory. And so I complained. I happened to know a guy who worked at the Disney Channel, and I wrote to him. I said, look, I know you're not in charge of this, but maybe you can pass it along. And I really think if, you know, it's one thing to do Sleeping Beauty's castle, because that's not history. But if you're saying you're presenting Lincoln, you have an obligation to do it correctly. And to their credit, they called me up and they said, you know, you're absolutely right. This thing's been up there for 30 years and no one really knows what it is, you know, how it got up there in the first place. So why don't you rewrite it, Professor? I like these Disney guys because they always call you Professor. You know, they seem to respect professors, unlike most places in the world. So, but before that, they said, you know, we also have this Hall of Presidents down at Orlando, Disney World, and that has a 5-minute history of the United States at the beginning, a little movie, you know, 5-minute history of the United States, and then all these, they have all the presidents there and their animatronic figures. And they said, you know, that's kind of out of date too. Why don't you look at that and we'll, so I rewrote that. I probably, and it's still up, I must be the historian who more people see their history of the United, you know, like millions of people see my 5-minute history of the United States in Orlando. And then, so we rewrote that, and then eventually I rewrote the, well, not rewrote, I mean, I chose more representative speeches of Lincoln for this robot.
They sent me your script
for
Anaheim, and including Frederick Douglass. And,
yeah, and then there was a slideshow, a narration which tried to be a little broader in what they were showing about Lincoln. You know, look, I don't claim that this is high class, you know, scholarship, but I don't think there's anything wrong with historians getting involved in popular history. In other words, if there's going to be history presented in a venue, it should be good history. Even if it's a very popular venue, I don't object to that. I think if it gets visitors interested in the history, that's all to the good, you know? And it doesn't claim to be a full examination of Lincoln's career and the Civil War, but it's a start. And I think, you know, people over the years who I don't even know have gotten in touch with me and said, you know, I really enjoyed that Lincoln thing. I didn't know this or I didn't know that. And so I think it does its job, you know, for that particular venue.
Now, you've been also involved in doing book reviews for various journals like The Nation. And how long has that been
Well, we all are asked to do book reviews, and that's part of our job as a scholar, in a sense. I mean, I write book reviews both for, very scholarly journals like the Journal of American History, and that's really just addressed to other historians, and you're evaluating the book purely as a contribution to scholarship and how it fits into long-running historiographical debates. But I've also reviewed for the New York Times Book Review, the LA Times Book Review, the Nation magazine, and there you're kind of writing a little bit differently. You're writing for an audience which is interested in history but isn't perhaps quite so knowledgeable about all these sometimes arcane debates. So you're trying to tell them, well, is this book significant? Is this book saying something new? Should you read this book, basically, and what will you get out of it if you do read it? So, I enjoy doing that. It gets you a free book. You don't get paid much for writing these things, but you get the free book. And it's just another part of this old Hofstadter thing of trying to bring history to an audience outside of the academic world, which I think is part of our obligation. Well, look, we're here in a library and museum, which attracts many, many people who are not scholars, obviously. The library gets a lot of scholars, but the museum is just full.
Well, actually, the biggest population in the library are genealogists.
Genealogists, of course, come in. But these are all, if someone comes to a place like this, or picks up a book review, then they already are interested to some degree, and you want to then make it worthwhile for them and to teach them something.
Now you have served, I guess, one of only one other individual who's been president of the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, and the American Society of Historians. So what motivated you to seek those presidencies? I mean,
those are
it's
not,
a lot of headaches.
You do not seek those presidencies.
You're elected.
You're not quite like General Sherman, where you absolutely refuse, but they call you. You are, and generally they don't actually have elections, really. One of them does. I think the AHA, you still run against someone else. The others, you're just chosen by a nominee. It's an honor. I mean, most of it is
Your name still goes on a ballot, though. People vote.
Well, they could cross your name off, like in the 19th century, and put someone else on. But it's an honor. It's recognition by your peers. So it's an obligation to the profession. These organizations actually have become more significant in the last 10, 15 years than they used to be in a public way, because there are all these issues relating to history that are kind of floating around, a Freedom of Information Act, and what the government's policy is toward releasing historical documents. And some of our more recent presidents have been very, very secretive or restrictive about what kind of public info, and so, what kind of historical documents will actually be released to the public. So these organizations get involved in trying to get Congress or the Archivist of the United States to actually make historical documents available to scholars. And we also get involved in trying to promote the teaching of history at the pre-collegiate level, because a lot of states have actually been reducing the amount of required history in their high school curricula, and we feel it's very important that history be taught. So there's a lot of public issues. It's not just worrying about where the next convention is going to be held.
Well, speaking of honors, you just received the Order of Lincoln. Wondering what that means, and also this is the bicentennial year. What should we take out of this?
Well, it is a great honor to be given this award, along with a lot of people who have done a lot more about Lincoln per se than I have. Lincoln pops up in a lot of my writings. He's in my first book on the Republican Party. He's in my book on Reconstruction, the early part. He's in a book I wrote about the idea of freedom in American history, because Lincoln had some very important things to say about American freedom. But I've actually never written a book about Lincoln per se. I recently edited a book of essays, including one by me and then several other people. My little secret here is I actually am writing a book about Lincoln now. I'm getting into Lincoln late, but I'm interested in Lincoln, the evolution of Lincoln's views about slavery and race over the course of his life. But to be there with people who have devoted their life to Lincoln, whether it's as a scholar, a collector, a museum person, a curator, is an honor, really. And I was very delighted to be selected for this. And the bicentennial is an opportunity, and I think it's working out this way, an opportunity to get people aware of critical issues in American history. And Lincoln, as you know very well, is a lens through which you can see so much of American history. You know, so many of the issues of his day are still around as issues of our day. That's why I think Lincoln, in a way, is so much more of a figure who we can relate to than, let's say, George Washington. You know, people revere George Washington, but somehow the issues of Washington's day seem very, very remote to us, very remote. Whereas the issues of Lincoln's day are still American issues, whether it's race relations or relations of the states and the federal government or civil liberties in wartime or, you know, many other, economic opportunity, many other issues that are critical to Lincoln are critical to us too. So I think the bicentennial is a way of us thinking about the historical origins of a lot of the challenges we face right now.
Professor Eric Foner, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Information about the Lincoln Academy of Illinois is available at thelincolnacademyofillinois.org.